The day John brought Rusty home was a bright spring morning, one that should have been filled with hope and excitement. Rusty was the culmination of a dream that John had held onto for years. A horse, he'd said, would be the perfect addition to our quiet little ranch, a symbol of freedom and adventure, something that would bring us closer as a couple. I remember standing by the gate, watching as John led Rusty out of the trailer, his face glowing with happiness. Rusty was stunning, a chestnut stallion with a glossy coat that gleamed in the sunlight, his mane blowing in the breeze. John was like a little boy with a new toy. He was ecstatic, unable to stop smiling as he introduced me to Rusty. I tried to mirror his enthusiasm, but there was something about Rusty, his size, his power, that made me nervous. I had never been around horses much, and I found their sheer presence intimidating. Still, I wanted to share in John's excitement, to be a part of this new chapter in our lives, so I reached out and stroked Rusty's nose, smiling as John watched us with pride. "You see. He likes you," John said, his voice filled with joy. "I knew you two would get along." I nodded, forcing a smile, but deep down, I felt a strange unease. I didn't understand it at the time, but something about that moment felt like the beginning of a shift, a change that would slowly alter the course of our lives. Over the next few weeks, John spent most of his time with Rusty. He woke up early each morning to feed him, groom him, and take him for rides across our property. He was dedicated, almost obsessed, and I watched from the sidelines as he poured his heart and soul into this new venture. It wasn't that I minded. I loved seeing John so happy, so passionate about something. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to feel a distance growing between us. It was as if Rusty had become the center of John's world, and I was left standing on the outside, looking in. Our evenings, once filled with laughter and conversation, became quiet. John would come back from the stable, his face flushed from the fresh air, and he would tell me about his day with Rusty, how well he was responding to training, how graceful he looked while galloping through the field. I would listen, nodding and smiling, but I found it increasingly difficult to connect with the stories. I wanted to be supportive, but I felt like an outsider, unable to share in John's newfound joy. One evening, after another long day apart, John suggested I join him in the stable. He wanted me to spend time with Rusty, to get to know him better. I hesitated at first. The idea of being around such a powerful animal made me uneasy, but John was insistent, and I wanted to make him happy. So I agreed. The stable was warm, the scent of hay and earth filling the air. Rusty stood tall in his stall, his eyes following us as we approached. John led me closer, encouraging me to stroke his neck. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, and Rusty lowered his head, nuzzling my palm. There was something gentle about him, something that put me at ease. I smiled, looking at John, who was watching us with a satisfied grin. "See, he's not so bad, is he?" John said, his voice soft. "No, he's not," I replied, and for a moment, I felt a connection, not just with Rusty, but with John. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough to make me feel hopeful, as if maybe this new chapter could bring us closer after all. After that, I started visiting Rusty more often. At first, it was always with John. We would go to the stable together, and John would teach me how to groom Rusty, how to feed him, how to saddle him. Those moments were rare, but they were precious, a glimpse of the life we had once shared, a life that seemed to have slipped away over the years. But as time went on, John became busier with work, and I found myself visiting Rusty alone. It started as an occasional visit, just to check on him when John was too busy. But over time, those visits became more frequent. I found solace in the stable, a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. The quiet, the warmth, the presence of Rusty, it was comforting, almost therapeutic. I would brush his coat, talk to him, tell him about my day. It felt silly at first, talking to an animal as if he could understand me, but Rusty listened without judgment, without interruption, and in those moments, I felt less alone. It wasn't long before my visits to the stable became a daily ritual. Every afternoon, after finishing my chores, I would head out to see Rusty. I would spend hours there, brushing his coat, feeding him treats, and just sitting with him, listening to the sound of his breathing, the rustle of the hay beneath his hooves. There was something about being there, something that made me feel safe, as if all the worries and fears that plagued me melted away in Rusty's presence. John noticed, of course. He would tease me about it sometimes, laughing as he said, "You're spending more time with that horse than you do with me, Victoria." I would laugh along, shrugging it off, but deep down, I knew there was some truth to his words. I loved John, I really did, but it felt like we were living in different worlds. He was so focused on his work, so consumed by his responsibilities, and I felt like an afterthought, like I was just there in the background of his life. One evening, John came home late from work. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped, his eyes heavy. I had been in the stable with Rusty, and when I walked back to the house, I found John sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked up at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Late night in the stable again?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge that made my heart sink. I forced a smile, trying to brush it off. "Just needed some fresh air," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I felt a pang of guilt. John stared at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine. "You've been spending a lot of time out there lately," he said, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. I shrugged, trying to keep my tone light. "Rusty's good company." John didn't say anything, but I could see the doubt in his eyes, the questions he didn't ask. He turned away, taking a sip of his drink, and I felt a knot form in my stomach. I wanted to say something to bridge the gap between us, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I turned and walked to the bedroom, leaving John alone in the kitchen, the silence between us growing heavier with each passing moment. The next day, I tried to make an effort. I made John's favorite breakfast, pancakes with fresh strawberries, and I sat with him at the table, trying to engage him in conversation. He smiled, thanked me for the meal, but his responses were short, his eyes distant. It was as if he was there physically, but his mind was somewhere else, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't reach him. That afternoon, I found myself back in the stable. I hadn't planned on it, I had told myself I would stay away, that I needed to focus on my marriage, but the house felt so empty, and I needed the comfort I found in Rusty. As I stood there, brushing his coat, I felt tears well up in my eyes. I rested my forehead against his side, closing my eyes. "I don't know what to do, Rusty," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I feel like I'm losing him, and I don't know how to get him back." Rusty turned his head, nudging me gently, and I let out a shaky breath. It was as if he understood, as if he knew exactly what I was feeling. I stayed there for a long time, the weight of my emotions pressing down on me, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to cry. I didn't hear John come in. His voice startled me, and I spun around, my heart pounding. "Victoria." He was standing by the stable door, his face half hidden in the shadows. There was confusion in his eyes, suspicion, and something else, something that looked like hurt. "John," I stammered, wiping at my eyes. I didn't hear you come in." He stepped closer, his gaze shifting from me to Rusty, and I could feel my stomach twist with unease. "You're crying," he said, his voice low. "What's going on?" I shook my head, trying to smile, but it felt forced. "It's nothing. It's been a long day." John's eyes narrowed, and he took another step forward. "Don't lie to me, Victoria," he said, his voice growing tense. "You've been spending so much time out here, and now I find you crying in the stable. What's going on?" I felt my chest tighten, panic rising in my throat. I didn't know how to explain it, how to put into words the loneliness, the longing, the connection I had found in Rusty. It sounded ridiculous, even to me, and I knew John wouldn't understand. "John, it's just a horse," I said, my voice trembling. "I've just been feeling a little off lately, that's all." John stared at me, his eyes filled with doubt. "Is there something going on between you and—" He glanced at Rusty, his voice trailing off, as if he couldn't bring himself to say the words. I felt my cheeks flush, a mix of guilt and frustration bubbling inside me. "What are you talking about?" I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. "He's a horse, John. How could you even suggest something like that?" John flinched, and I immediately regretted my words. He looked away, his shoulders sagging. "I don't know, Victoria," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I feel like I'm losing you, and I don't know what to do." The pain in his voice cut through me, and I felt tears welling up again. I stepped forward, reaching out to touch his arm. "John, I'm sorry," I said, my voice breaking. "I never meant to make you feel that way. I love you. I've been feeling so lost, and I didn't know how to talk to you about it." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of emotions, hurt, confusion, and something else, something softer. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Why didn't you come to me?" I shook my head, tears spilling down my cheeks. "I didn't want to burden you," I whispered. "You've been so busy, and I felt like I was just in the way." John closed his eyes, his jaw tightening. He reached up, taking my hand in his, and for a moment, we stood there, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. "I'm not too busy for you, Victoria," he said, his voice softening. "I never wanted you to feel that way. You're my wife and I love you. I didn't realize how bad things had gotten." I nodded, my heart aching. "I love you too, John," I whispered. I don't know how to fix this." John squeezed my hand, his eyes meeting mine. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice steady. "We'll figure it out together." Thank you for watching this video. Make sure you subscribe to this channel for more videos.